So our speaker today is Paulo Ribeiro, who is a longtime member of the Bergen Ethical Society. Paulo is on the faculty of the American Ethical Union's Lay Leadership Summer School. He currently works for Columbia School of Engineering and Applied Science. He has a master's degree from Teachers College's Design and Development of Digital Games program, holds a BA from Montclair State University in Sociology, and is a graduate of the Humanist Institute. He's been studying pro-social applications of digital technologies and has created a board game that encourages people to explore environmental, social, and economic concerns. I can also say I just learned today that Paulo is leading the adult education component at the Bergen Ethical Society. So you may want to pick his brain at some point about things that might be really interesting for us, because I know he's got a lot going on there. Anyway, Paulo's address today is titled, Will Technology Save Us or Destroy Us?
Yeah, so this is actually modified from a talk that I gave last week at the Bergen Society, which was actually part 2 of a talk which I gave the previous year. And on that one, the topic was on text image generation, which at that point we had just started seeing a number of these programs that would allow you to just type in what it is that you wanted, and then it would automatically generate a picture from that. And so the talk that I gave was about that and how it's going to affect artists and, you know, what potentially might come in the future from that. And that was in November, beginning of November. And then a few weeks after that, ChatGPT came out, which dramatically changed the landscape and really just sort of thrust this whole topic into public conversation. So in the past year, what have we really seen in terms of this? So we've seen a tidal wave of venture capital that is being poured into numerous generative AI companies. I also gave a talk in September of last year at Teachers College in the Games Research Lab about generating images. And one of the questions that the students asked was, do I think that AI image generation is going to contribute to the issue of fake news and the spreading of misinformation and disinformation? And I said, probably not, because the images are not really that convincing. And then Midjourney version 5 came out, which immediately started being able to produce images that looked absolutely photorealistic. And you may have already seen some of these, floating around and coming into the news. The most famous one, I think, was a picture of the Pope. Some of you may have seen this, wearing this big, fluffy, very stylish looking jacket, which looked like a real photo. And first time I saw it, I kind of scrolled past it thinking it's a weird looking, but it didn't occur to me that it might have been AI. Sure enough, it was.
One day we walk down and say, well,
Yeah,
but I've got a little bit of headache. I don't feel great.
Yeah, maybe you don't, just in case you
Yeah,
say.
and that's typical.
Getting some conversation from Zoom over there.
Go and take a cup of half calf.
Also,
Give myself a little
Okay.
spark.
Tell me when you want me to take you over there.
Well, I'm going to have to quickly do a shower, so
Yeah, okay.
Everyone knows around.
technology run amok. We've also seen, for example, that this being used now in politics. So the Ron DeSantis's campaign used AI-generated fake photos to attack Trump in some of his ads. You had a picture of Trump kissing Anthony Fauci, I think was one of the images that they used. We've also seen a number of prominent online publications have started outsourcing low-priority article writing to text generating AI. So BuzzFeed is one of probably the most famous company doing this. And so instead of paying writers, they're now just having ChatGPT generate stuff for them. Tech companies like Microsoft and Google are rushing to integrate large language models into various parts of their operations. However, there's a huge issue here, which is that these large language models that they're using do what's called hallucinating. So they tend to just generate information that is completely untrue, but it certainly sounds like it's true, and people can just accept it as fact. And so a lot of these companies are rolling out these technologies without any regard to the fact that they're going to be producing vast amounts of misinformation. We've also seen artists and writers have launched a number of lawsuits against tech companies that have built their AI models on large data sets of copyrighted materials. So essentially the way this works in very broad terms is that less sophisticated programs have been used to sort of scrape this vast amount of visual data and text data from the internet and create these huge repositories of information. And then these AI models have been trained off of that information. So it's important to note that they are not. So one of the things people get confused about is that this, for example, AI image generation is not sort of creating a collage out of this previous information. It's generating it from scratch, but it was trained, it learned how to draw these pictures from this vast repository of copyrighted information. So now there's a number of lawsuits about that. I think they are going to have a very tough road ahead trying to make the argument that this is some sort of copyright infringement, because there is some precedent for using copyrighted materials under the guise of fair use for training AI. So I think it's going to be pretty difficult, but they may see some results from these lawsuits that might tighten things up a little bit. There's also, in my sphere, in education, concerns over rampant cheating in education using large language models like ChatGPT. A number of teachers are already saying that a lot of the essays that they're seeing appear to have been generated. And there's also been some terrible applications of this technology by teachers as well. There was an example in Texas, I believe, at a university where the professor just started taking each of the students' essays, feeding it into ChatGPT and saying, "Did you write this?" Which again, ChatGPT hallucinates. So a lot of times ChatGPT would say, "Yes, I wrote this." You can't use it that way. And so that was a big scandal there. There was also an incident where a lawyer used ChatGPT to try to generate a brief with citing all these different court cases that don't exist, and the judge was absolutely not happy about that. There's also been concerns about large language models potentially at some point being able to generate things like film scripts and movie scripts. And so you might have heard that coming up as an issue in the recent writer's strike. Auto workers also are on strike as well, and part of their concern is over automation, not so much from language models, but from robotics and other forms of automation. So we're seeing that this issue is becoming quite important in a number of areas. We also see in California, there's a bill right now that would require autonomous trucks that have no driver to have a safety driver. So obviously the Teamsters Union very much pushing for that. But there's also a lot of pushback on the other side of it as well. And so we see a whole variety of areas where these sort of technological issues are coming up that really, is happening so fast at this point. So for the talk, I'm not really going to be focusing on a lot of specific events that have happened recently, just because the technology really does change that quickly. And the problem of sort of talking about these things and talking about past events when talking about these things is that technological growth is exponential. And so the idea is that no matter where you are on this sort of curve of technological change, you're always looking back at a landscape that is very different. So one of the examples I like to use is more time has passed between the construction of the Great Pyramid and the birth of Cleopatra than Cleopatra's death and today, right? But if you look at that 2,500-year history between the pyramids and Cleopatra, there was very little technological change. Whereas if we plot out technological change since her death, I mean, it goes straight up into the point where the curve is almost vertical. So relying on historical examples may not be super useful for trying to predict where the technology is going to go next, but it may help us get some insights about how people have responded to these problems in the past. And I've seen a lot of really bad takes on what's going on right now from various different people and all sides of the issue. And so I thought I would go over a few of the ones that I have a real issue with. So in terms of historical thinking, there's two broad categories that I take issue with. So the first one I describe as there was nothing before me. So everything that's new to me is also new to the world. And the reality is that issues around automation and the possibility of technological unemployment are very, very old. So Emperor Vespasian, for example, proposed the use of machinery to move columns in Rome because he was worried that it would put workers out of work and that this would lead to political instability in Rome. Elizabeth I rejected a patent for a stocking frame knitting machine over fears of unemployment. European cities banned automatic looms in the 17th century as they were concerned it would throw all of these textile workers out of work, and there was riots and things like that. Qing dynasty officials in the 19th century resisted adopting European manufacturing methods, in part out of fear of displacing workers, which obviously then meant that China was significantly far behind Europe in terms of economic progress by the beginning of the 20th century. And also in the 1930s, we saw a lot of concern around this during the Great Depression as well. And so also, it was something that was used as a political tool as well. So Alfred Hugenberg, who was a prominent member of the Nazi Party, proclaimed, quote, "Never again must the worker be replaced by a machine." And several decades later, American philosopher Erich Hoffer in 1965 said, quote, "A skilled population deprived of its sense of usefulness would be the ideal setup for an American Hitler." Yeah, so that is definitely one of the issues that I have. I mean, another example of that type of thing is, every generation complains that the kids aren't all right. Kids these days, they're a real problem. But you can find examples of that going all the way back to ancient Greece for people complaining about that. And if it actually were true, at this point, we would have gone completely feral. The opposite side of the problem that I have is people who sort of take this attitude like there's nothing new under the sun, right? So everything, history is just one big cycle. It all comes looping back around again. And anything that's going on now, you can point to some sort of example in the past where it's basically the same thing. We've seen, for example, things like resistances to quarantines and vaccines. In the 1830s, there was a cholera outbreak that spread across the world, and there was violent riots that took place when governments tried to clamp down and restrict people's movement. In 1904 in Rio de Janeiro, where I was born, there was a vaccine riot because people didn't want to get to get the vaccines that were being required. So a lot of these things do come up again and again, but they're not always the same. And just because somehow we got through it in the past doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a lot of pain about that. So one example that I saw recently, which I thought was a terrible take on our modern situation, was someone was talking about political polarization, elite political polarization. And they're saying, well, we've had lots of periods of political polarization. It's cyclical. For example, right before the American Civil War, there was plenty of political polarization. So this stuff isn't new. I think, yes, the American Civil War, the one that led to 625,000 deaths. Sure, yeah, I guess you could argue that we should be optimistic because this type of thing just comes and goes, and you just kind of yada yada over all the tragedy that goes along the way. And we have seen early examples of automation before, right? So, of course, probably the most famous example was the Luddites. Violently resisted the introduction of automated looms. And another example that I saw in a research paper recently looked at phone operators. And so they looked at, so you had the invention of the phone in the late 19th century, and you had all these people who had to actually manually connect the calls together. And then in the early 20th century, someone came along and invented the automatic switchboard, which made all those jobs obsolete. And the automatic switchboard actually has kind of an interesting story because it was invented by a funeral director who was upset because in his local town, the switchboard operator was the wife of the competing funeral home operator. And so she was redirecting all the calls for him to his competition. And he said, no, there's got to be a better way to do things. And so he was the one who patented the first automatic switchboard. And within a couple of years, or within a couple of decades, all of those jobs were gone. And so there was a recent study looking at how did those phone operators fare, because for a lot of them, this was an entry-level position. And what they found was that most of them ended up just going and doing something else. And that it didn't really seem like a lot of them had any long-term impact on their lives because of the fact that their entire field had essentially been removed. But that being said, phone operators didn't require years of expensive schooling when their whole profession vanished, right? So young people today are having to spend, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars going to college to get a degree, and then suddenly we're going to say, oh, the field you studied for just doesn't exist anymore. Sorry, you're going to have to go back to school and accumulate more debt and then enter a new field, and then that field will be gone within 5 to 10 years, right? So when I first started getting interested in this topic over 10 years ago now, people just sort of assumed, well, technological unemployment happens, but it always creates more complexity in the economy. And so therefore, there's just going to be a lot of new jobs that you won't even be able to imagine what those jobs are going to be. And that is true, or historically has been true. But really what happens is that new tasks get created. But those new tasks aren't necessarily tasks that have to be done by a person. One of the examples I was thinking about the other day was, some of you may remember in the mid 2000s, there was something called Cha-Cha. And so what Cha-Cha was a text messaging service where you would just type in a question that you had and send it off on your phone before the arrival of the smartphone. And then a real person would get that text message on the other side and look up whatever question you had and then send you back an answer. Within 10 years, that business was completely dead because the next year, smartphones came out, the iPhone released, and people could just go into their smartphone and just look it up in Google, and Google's algorithms have gotten progressively better, and so it understood people's inquiries better, and so there was just no need for this human intermediary. And so then you see new technologies like, 10 years ago now or so, you had Shazam, which is an app that you can just hold up when you hear music playing, and it takes a little sample of the music that's playing in the room and then will tell you what song that comes from. Well, there was never a service where a human being would listen on the other end of the phone for what music you were currently listening to and then tell you what song it was. That was, from the get-go, was automatically something that was done by a machine, and at no point was there a human being doing that. So we create new tasks, but we don't necessarily create new jobs, new professions. One of the other problems that I see when people talk about these types of issues is the comparing of an ideal situation and not the status quo. So one of the issues you see right now is something around, driverless cars. Certainly been a huge issue in San Francisco, where a lot of these tech companies are based. There's been some real resistance. People are putting traffic cones on top of these automated vehicles because the vehicles can't drive with something on the hood, so they will just stand there and not move. So there's forms of resistance that are springing up. And a lot of times when people talk about the ethics of self-driving cars, they'll sort of bring up this issue of the trolley problem. So if you've ever heard of the trolley problem, the idea is there's this trolley that's driving down on a track. It's out of control. And on the track on one side is one worker, and then on the other side, there's 5 workers on another track. And you are the person with the switch. And you have to decide which way do you want the trolley to go. And currently it's driving towards the 5 workers. Do you pull the lever and then direct it towards the 1 worker to save 4 lives and only lose 1? And so then people bring this issue up of, teaching this kind of ethics to a self-driving car. Does it run over the old person crossing the street, or does it hit the baby in the baby carriage if it's careening out of control, right? However, there is another trolley problem, a bigger trolley problem at work here, which is the fact that it isn't a question of, do we have some accidents and some fatalities by introducing driverless cars versus none? It's an issue of, do we have some fatalities from driverless cars versus the 40,000 people who die every year in the United States, killed by any number of the 290 million registered vehicles driven by human beings? That's the actual reality. That's what we're dealing with. We're not in a car-free country and debating on whether or not we want to have self-driving cars. We are in a country where there are millions of cars being driven by people who kill people because they're, for various reasons. But it could be they're drunk, there could be they're texting, could be that they're sleepy, and machines don't have those problems. And there have been certain companies like Tesla, for example, that have released self-driving functions that have been very not street ready, certainly. And there have been a number of accidents related to that. But there are other companies that are actually seem to be performing better than human drivers, where they are still getting into accidents, but 60% of those accidents were caused by the other human driver. So if we find ourselves at a point where, driverless vehicles have half as many accidents as human drivers, then do we just try to expedite the process of getting all the human drivers off the road? It would certainly save thousands of lives. But at the same time, we would also be accepting that some number of lives are going to die at the hands of an automated vehicle. In the same way, we also see algorithms increasingly being used in a variety of different ways, taking decision-making out of the hands of human beings in things like determining medical care, recommending people for different types of procedures. We see it being used in the justice system, so bail setting, prison sentencing, increasingly is being done by algorithms to make recommendations. And the number of people have pointed out that these still have many of the same biases that humans do here, and that they will still recommend cheaper procedures, for example, for people of color in medical situations. They will recommend harsher bail sentences. They will recommend longer prison sentences. But there is a question, if they're doing better than humans in these areas, do we still leave that in the hands of humans? Or do we switch over with the understanding that the technology is still not where it needs to be? I'm not here to provide any answers. I'm merely offering that as a question. So in terms of some good ways to look at things, I've brought some different ideas on that as well. So one of the things that I've really enjoyed is this concept of infraethics. So this was a term coined by Luciano Floridi, he's a researcher, and it refers to ethics being built directly into the design of a technological artifact. So one of the things you'll hear people say sometimes is, well, the technology is neutral. It's just how people use it. And the reality is technologies are not ethically neutral because technologies are designed for purposes. And purposes are rarely, if ever, ethically neutral. Take, for example, a butter knife versus a sword. They're both blades, right? And in theory, I guess I could use a sword to butter a piece of bread, And I guess I could use a butter knife to kill somebody. I mean, not me, but like James Bond could. But clearly, they are both very good at doing very different types of things, and those things are not ethically neutral. So treating tech as ethically neutral shifts all the moral responsibility from the people who design it and manufacture it to the people who use it, and they make it an end user problem. So we need to do away with that sort of thinking. Technology has to be designed in a way that is ethical from the get-go. And we have to also ask, if we somehow did design it to have essentially complete freedom in terms of how it was used, wouldn't that also make it unethical? If we built a piece of technology and then deliberately left off guardrails that prevented people from using it in bad ways, doesn't that make it unethical? Doesn't it make our actions unethical by doing that? So this is something that people in the tech industry are also dealing with as well. And there's been a number of different types of frameworks to try to deal with these problems. So one of the more prominent ones is called value-sensitive design. And so the idea is technological artifacts should support the values of stakeholders rather than undermine or usurp them. This often gets used in something like smartphones, for example, that smartphone apps and features on smartphones should be used in a way that augments people's lives rather than sort of encourages behavior that takes away from people's lives. So you think about the amount of time people spend on Facebook and stuff like that is often designed in a way that serves the needs of Facebook and their advertisers, but not necessarily in a way that serves the interests of the person who's using the product, because it encourages them to just keep using and using and using and using, to the detriment of other aspects of their lives. So value-sensitive design has a strong emphasis on stakeholder analysis. So figuring out who has a stake in this technology, who is affected by this technology. And it's often more than just the user and the person designing it. Is also, how it's sourced, for example, is one issue. How, after its lifespan, when it's done, how is it being discarded? There's a huge problem of e-waste, for example, electronics waste that's ending up in developing countries, and is a big issue there. So it's about really sitting down and thinking about who's being impacted on these things, and also participatory design, where you bring those people in and you actually talk to them and find out what their needs are, and then try to build around that. An example I was reading about recently was during the Obama administration, there was a real interest in developing an app that would help people find colleges and shop around for colleges. And so they built out this app. They hired a company to build out this app. No one used it, no interest whatsoever. And when a team of technologists were brought in to examine why no one had used it, they realized that the contractor that had been hired to build this app didn't talk to anybody. They didn't ask anybody what they wanted. They just took, what they saw Amazon doing and just said, okay, we'll just do that. And so they built out all these features that no one asked for and wasn't useful for shopping for colleges, because shopping for colleges is not the same as shopping for pants. And so they ended up completely redesigning it from the ground up after having actually spoken to people and figuring out what their needs were. Another prominent framework is something called capability approach. So this is used in more than just technology. This is also a tool used in policymaking. And so this is really built around the idea of developing systems that give people abilities and capabilities rather than restricting them. So this was originally developed by philosophers Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, who's one of my favorite philosophers of the modern era. And so they built this out really as a kind of ethics tool for economic development. And so Nussbaum highlights 10 major areas of capability. So life, just the ability to live, bodily health, bodily integrity, so having a sense of autonomy and feeling in control of your own body, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, the ability to engage in reasoning behavior, affiliation, so friends and associations, other species, so being able to have a concern for the planet and other animals, play, just the ability to have fun, and also material and political control over one's environment. And so the idea is that policies or technologies or other things like that that work towards giving people more of those abilities is a good thing, and things that take away from those abilities, or at the very least, give those abilities in much greater quantity to some people and not others, that is really what defines it as good or evil or right or wrong. And so this is very relevant to technologies, because technologies frequently either constrain or enhance abilities. And all this ties into a matter of systems thinking. So thinking about the cascading effects of design choices. Just because we build something that expands the capability of some users doesn't mean there aren't far-reaching effects that negatively impact the capabilities of others. And so then we're designing solutions that get to the root of problems rather than target the most visible events in the system, right? So if we have, a city built next to a river, for example, and a lot of people are getting sick from the water that's being pumped up from the river, and then we know that upriver there's a factory that's dumping toxic waste in the river, the problem is not at the pump. The problem is at the factory. And so with systems thinking, you try to think about, beyond where the problem is happening to thinking what are the sources of the problem, and try to address those the more distant causes. So systems thinking can also be used to create regulations that are less draconian and coercive than might end up being if policymakers just try to legislate the immediate effects of the problem. So one of the examples that I've read also was talking about in Iraq, not long after the United States had invaded. And there was an issue where in one of these cities, every Friday after mosque, they were having riots that were taking place. People would show up to the main square, they would protest, they'd be there for several hours, and then inevitably things would become violent, and then riot police would have to be called in, and it would turn into this big bloody mess. And so the authorities were watching the surveillance footage of these types of these events, and they noticed that people during the protests were buying food from the food vendors in the square. And so they tried a new approach, which was they just pushed all the food vendors out into the surrounding streets and didn't let any food be sold in the town square. And so people still came to protest, but instead of protesting and hanging around for hours and getting angry and then rioting, they would just protest and then go home. So just by dealing with that one issue, they removed the need for this much more violent repression, right? And I'm not necessarily saying that this is that this policy is necessarily great, and obviously the war itself has all manner of ethical issues to it, but it does give you an idea how you can think about the larger systems at play to create sort of innovative ways to deal with problems. There are, of course, a number of problems with implementations of these types of things. So companies often disregard these ethical considerations in the design process and send their products to market without proper safeguards, right? So we talked about how Microsoft and Google are going full steam ahead with introducing large language models into their various tools, regardless of the fact that these tend to produce very erroneous results. And it's actually worse than a matter of just pure greed. So many in Silicon Valley have adopted a philosophy that technological disruption is inherently good. Right? You may have heard the term "move fast and break things" is a term that comes out of Silicon Valley, which, you see all these companies like Uber and Airbnb, and they really tout the fact that they've upended all of these traditional legacy industries like hotels and like taxi services and things like that. And in their mind, if something can be disrupted, it should be disrupted. And of course, that doesn't really make any sense. There's all sorts of reasons why that's a problem, but this is very much a mantra that's been adopted in Silicon Valley. So if companies don't practice ethical design, then that will require some sort of regulation to force ethical design. However, there are issues there as well, in that regulators often lag significantly behind technological development, which again, as we said before, is only accelerating and only becoming more and more difficult to stay up with. And yes, we did have a few weeks ago, there was an AI summit or forum that was being held, organized by Chuck Schumer in the Senate. But we are facing a point where Congress is the oldest it has ever been, and it is likely to only keep getting older as time goes on, for the foreseeable future at least. And so we have a whole bunch of people currently in Congress who really have never grown up with any of these digital technologies and have at best a passing understanding of how these things work. Not to mention the fact that, as in the case with that forum, it was mostly attended by a lot of these big tech companies and their CEOs who were saying everything's fine, don't worry about it. And the tech companies have very deep pockets to buy off legislators and other policymakers. And we've also seen something of an attempt to preempt these ethical issues with the tech companies as well. So if you actually listen to what a lot of the tech companies are saying in terms of what we need to worry about in terms of AI, they're talking about rogue AI. They're talking about this possibility that we're going to construct a super intelligent AI that will break free of the constraints of its handlers and will wipe us out or take over everything or something like that. And what a lot of watchdogs are saying in the industry is that, yeah, it's not that there's a zero chance of that happening someday, but that's not an issue for today. That's not something that's going to happen anytime in the near future. The technology simply is not powerful enough for this, emergent AI to come around that's going to doom us all. But what is something that can happen is these technologies can be used by people to hurt other people and can be abused. And that's something that, generally speaking, OpenAI and Google and Microsoft don't want to talk about. They want to talk about the doomsayer stuff that's basically got no real chance of happening, at least in the short term. And then we also have to consider, are there some technologies that are just impossible to design ethically, that it's just definitely going to be unethical no matter what? And then do we have to look into some kind of outright bans on these types of things? And to what degree can we even ban these things? If we ban it here in the United States, but it's allowed somewhere else, that is certainly an issue we're seeing right now with a lot of these large language models and with the image generation models, which is that even if the United States banned these technologies tomorrow, they still will continue to exist in other places where copyright laws are less stringent and things like that. And so in some ways, can we even put the horse back into the barn at this point? So what can we do? So one thing we can do is support watchdog groups that are performing external audits. So one of the people who was at this forum was Deborah Raji, who she and her team have done a lot of work around facial recognition software and the biases that come with that. So facial recognition software has notoriously been pretty bad about correctly identifying dark-skinned faces. And so when they first were auditing this technology, they found it was absolutely abysmal because it had been trained on mostly white faces. In fact, I mean, my joke was that they probably just went around to each of the Google offices and just took pictures of each of the staff members and fed that into the machine. And yet, by bringing this information to Google, she has said that within the first year, there were dramatic changes, and the software worked much better and produced much better results and was much less biased than it had been previously. So it's not totally just, you know, banging your fist against a wall. You know, there are changes that are made. You know, because tech companies are not monoliths. They are like any other organization. They have competing values and interests inside. There are many people who work for these organizations that want to live in a free, safe, and just society, just like the rest of us. And we can also push for meaningful regulation. As with anything else, we have the ability to sway our legislators and government agencies through organized petitioning and lobbying. We have the ability to participate in public comment. Regulatory bodies are seeking input from the public. We have the ability to vote, so we can vote out people who are too cozy with the tech companies and try to bring in people who are going to regulate them a little more strictly. And when all else fails, we have the ability to take to the streets and demonstrate, strike, and otherwise do a little disrupting ourselves, putting traffic cones on top of the cars, for example. So we can have a future where the dull, dangerous, and undignified work is done by machines, where AI helps us make new scientific discoveries, where common diseases and health disorders are a thing of the past, where civic technologies enable us to engage with each other and society in more powerful ways, where scientific progress allows us to live more harmoniously with the planet, and it allows us all to flourish. Or we can have a future where billions of us scrape by on a planet hollowed out by extraction, living under the boot of a tiny elite, enjoying near godlike powers using AI and robots to enforce an unchangeable status quo. Ultimately, it is not going to be the machines that decide our fate. Even if they do eventually wrest control away from us, we will arrive at that point through our own action or inaction. We might not be in the last chapters of the book of life. Maybe our creations will carry on our story for us someday. But for better or worse, we will write our last chapter whenever it comes, either now or a trillion years from now, ourselves. Thank you.
I think timing-wise, it'd probably be best to more opened up. Just I think a few photographs so I know who was here. So thank you, Paulo. And so this is an opportunity for people to kind of get into the conversation here. We invite you. Kevin has a microphone, so we'll deal with the people first. What are the thoughts and feelings you have in response to today's address?
I have just one question. I can start. This Chat GPT.
Mhm.
This is software that I can download or I can access. Anyone can access online, or how does that work? 'Cause I don't know. I've heard about it, but I don't know exactly how this thing is accessed and how it exactly works.
Yeah, you wouldn't download it. You would go to the website, which is the company's OpenAI. So you just go to their website and you can access it there. There is a free version that anybody can use, and then there's also a paid tier where it gives you access to the more powerful language model that it's currently using, and it gives you more ability to run more queries as well.
I see. And you just put it, and then you say, make me a. You can select generate a book report on this, and it'll do a book report on Homer Simpson or whatever.
Yeah, and it's pretty impressive, you know, what it is capable of doing. I saw a video the other, and so one of the very weird things about it is that it's actually extremely receptive to pep talks. So they have found that if you tell it to take a deep breath, you know, think about it a little bit longer, put its thinking cap on, it actually produces better results than if you just say, do X, Y, Z. But it also has the ability to look at images. I'm doing air quotes there. Look at images as well. So one of the things I saw the other day, which was very scary, which was that someone who was a web developer took a picture of the whiteboard where he and his team had been, planning out a website. And so it had all these little boxes like, oh, here's the login screen and here's the dashboard and other things like that with arrows and stuff. And then he posted that picture into ChatGPT and he said, generate the code necessary to make each one of these pages. And it did. So it looked at the whiteboard, understood what it was looking at, and then generated the code to do this. Now, there's probably lots of errors in it, and you probably wouldn't want to just copy and paste it into your website and call it a day, but it does have the ability to really produce some very scarily useful tools through coding and also through text as well.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you. Yuval Noah Harari wrote about a lot about AI and how it could pose ethical and create dangers to who humanity is in the future. And he paints this picture of forever humans have sought immortality. And there's a way of doing that when you use robotics. We increasingly are becoming bionic men and women. We have new hips and new knees, and they could replace all these parts. But eventually, there might be a hybrid where for your immortality, you have to sort of have a blend between human and android until eventually the androids maybe take more power than the humans. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, so that's definitely in the more, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 200 years from now type frame. But yeah, I do think that it is going to be somewhat inevitable that we will kind of merge with our technologies a bit more. We're already starting to see that. For example, prostheses are getting a lot better. So you will see people have these robotic prostheses that are able to read very slight signals in their extremities, and then be able to move a robotic hand, for example, in the way as if it was really their arm. You're also seeing EEG, which is non-invasive, and then also chips being put into the brain that is invasive, that is able to read our thoughts, and we can control things with that. There's Neuralink is one company that's working on that. That's one of Elon Musk's many projects. So yeah, I think we are definitely going to see more integration between human and machine moving forward, which doesn't necessarily have to look like the Borg from Star Trek, right? We sort of have this, horrifying image of something like that, but it could actually be something quite beautiful if done well.
Hi, Paolo. Thank you. Yeah, my concern, aside from facial recognition quandary, is the effect the internet has had on journalism and journalists, in particular, investigative journalism. And I use the example of Mary Mapes, who was the CBS producer who initially broke the story on Abu Ghraib and then was producing or did produce for 60 Minutes the scandal or investigation about Bush and his National Guard being given a preference, and how they had so much evidence, but they never had the original document. And they went after her and they said, well, this could have been produced on Microsoft. This could have been falsified. And CBS, of course, is owned by Viacom. Bush was a big contributor and allowed them to grow and grow and grow. And of course, this was right before his second election. She was debunked. Dan Rather stepped down after 24 years in journalism. Her team were all let go, and she never again entered journalism. And yet CBS earned a Peabody for her producing the Abu Ghraib investigation. I was just wondering what you thought. They used They used it in an internal investigation that Microsoft could have produced the documents.
Yeah, so we actually are starting to see some stuff like that. So one of the problems, of course, is the Pope issue I brought up earlier, where you have this image that is fake that people then share as if it were real. And I'm definitely seeing a lot of that going on. Not so much political stuff, but a lot of just, oh, isn't this neat? Look, somebody made this cool thing. And then I have to go and say, well, actually, that's a AI generated photo. That's not real. Someone didn't make a, bed shaped like a cow or something like that. And so we are seeing stuff like that, but we're also seeing the other end of things where, because people now know that this type of technology exists, they can just argue, oh, well, it's not real. And in fact, Elon Musk, again, his legal team tried to do this with a lawsuit that they were having this year over Tesla and some promises that Elon had made on camera, where his legal team tried to argue in front of a judge, oh, that was just a deep fake. That wasn't real. He didn't really do that. That's, it's fake footage, right? The judge wasn't buying it, but they still felt that they could make that argument in a court of law. So that is definitely something that we could see moving forward, where people just say, oh, it's not real. It's fake, just whenever it's convenient. Yeah, absolutely. That could be a problem.
Hello, on the screen.
Oh, we have a
Yeah, we have somebody.
Can you hear me? Hello?
What was the question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Oh,
Go
you
ahead.
can, okay. So then, the first thing I want to do is thank you for your talk. I'd like to mention two things. One is that Bart was very kind a number of weeks ago to invite me that I could give a speech and read an editorial that I wrote that was published on the pernicious effects of social media, and the fact that from a technological standpoint, you gave a great presentation, but we need to be able to control that. And right now it is out of control. So number one, it's a little bit like the tobacco industry or any other industry that is running by itself until we catch up and realize people are dying from lung cancer, and you start to regulate and you get pushback. Now, all over Europe and all over the world, we realize that we have Frankenstein. We've created a monster. It's a tool that can kill or it can save. It can make the world better or it can make the world worse. So part of the discussion from an ethical standpoint needs to be addressing the use and misuse and control. It shouldn't be up to Google or Elon Musk or whatever to put out whatever they want without the guardrails that society imposes, or else it does have the potential, just like nuclear weapons, just like environmental devastation, it has the potential to destroy us all, and certainly to destroy democracy, which we're seeing in our society today. So that's the first thing I want to mention, is addressing the legal controls over this extremely powerful technology. That is an ethical mission. And I do have an invitation if anyone wants to take it up. Tomorrow night at 7 o'clock at the Scarsdale Public Library, I am actually giving a lecture or a presentation which will deal with what we should do, what we need to do. I don't need to understand AI in order to know that we need to impose some controls. So if you'd like to come, Scarsdale Library, 7 o'clock tomorrow in the North Meeting Room. Love to see as many people as want to show up.
Thanks, Richard.
Did you
Thank
want
you,
to,
Thank you.
did you want to respond first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. That definitely there's a lot of issues around social media that need to be looked at, and we have essentially left it to these companies to regulate themselves on a lot of that. And there's a whole other issue that I would get into, but I think we're running short on time, so I won't. But yeah, there are some real issues around that.
I agree with what was just said. I'm going to head for the Scarsdale Library probably tomorrow.
Thank you.
Um, so, but yeah, those are my thoughts. There's going to be very wealthy people out of this, and I think the rest of the population on the earth are going to be poor, because it takes money also to cater to all of our wants of conveniences. And conveniences don't always come that cheaply. There's a lot of jobs people are losing as a result, and people in the arts, people all over the things. This is not going to be regulatory. There's going to be somebody on the top who's going to profit and be in control and can manipulate. There's the possibility. It may happen, it may not, but knowing human nature, eventually it probably will. And it takes money. So who has the money of all of us to really buy these conveniences if we don't have jobs, if the jobs are no longer needed? Where is the income? And the people on the top always are counting money. They want more numbers, trillions, billions, quadrillions. It's never enough. It's called greed. And people suffer below that. And that's a large amount of people. Yes, they can do this for you. They can do that for you. They can think for you. So you don't have to think anymore or question the people on top. There's a sinister underlying that I find. I'm almost going to say that I'm going to be happy that I'm long gone dead, so I don't have to experience this. But the people below, coming up from my the rest of my family who have yet to be born are going to feel the effects, the negative effects from this. Who's going to pay for this? Who's going to have it?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a major issue. There's a great book called Lights in the Tunnel. I can't remember the author's name right now, but if you Google Lights in the Tunnel, you'll find the author. And that was written back in 2009, but he essentially talks about how, that really the entire economy would be in jeopardy in these types of scenarios where everything has sort of been automated, because, aside from the great suffering that would cause, the reality is that the super wealthy might buy a few houses, but they're not going to buy 100,000 houses. The super wealthy might buy a few cars, but they're not going to buy 100,000 cars. And if none of the rest of us have any money, they have nothing to sell to anybody. And so it has all these like knock-on effects. Jaron Lanier is another really good resource. He wrote a book called Who Owns the Future? And he talks about how, so much is free these days. So much is just given away freely on the internet, not freely. Usually it requires your data in exchange. But that, he says, when everything's free except one thing, that's where poverty is. So if you are able to watch any movie you want for free on your smartphone anytime you want, that's great. But if food still costs money and you have no money, then you're going to starve to death. So yeah, absolutely. The sort of accumulation of resources in the hands of a very few people is disastrous for everyone, including them ultimately.
Thank you, Paulo.